Welcome to Clydebuilt Conversations. Our guest is Ambassador Charles Ray, author, retired U.S. Foreign Service officer, and U.S. Army veteran, including tours in the Vietnam War. I spoke to Ambassador Ray about leadership, ethics, management, and a host of other subjects. Ambassador Charles Ray, thank you for sitting down with Clydebuilt Conversations today. We appreciate your time. And one thing I note about you is you're an incredibly prolific writer. You've created about 100 works of fiction and nonfiction over what has been a very busy career. And how do you do that? Tell me about managing one's career and producing so much as far as the written word is concerned. How do you go about doing that?
Well, a number of ways. I mean, you mentioned managing a career. One of the key issues is managing your time, whatever you do, but particularly if you're involved in creative activities, is that you have to look at the day ahead of you, realizing that it has 24 hours, and then you look at the things that you have to do in order to survive. Adequate sleep, nourishment, exercise, fresh air, psychically time with your significant other, your friends and family, sort of your soul, your soul exercise, if you will. And when you subtract that out of a 24-hour day, believe it or not, you still got a good 8 hours of time that's what I call discretionary. I mean, you can use it as you see fit. Unfortunately, a lot of people just fritter it away because, their useful time comes in 5-minute increments because they're so scattered in other things. What I learned to do, well, actually as a kid, but what I really had to learn it when I joined the Army, was to use my 24 hours in ways that were productive. My wife calls it anal retentive and a little obsessive, but I eat 3 meals a day on a regular schedule. I like to have my breakfast, my lunch, and my supper within a very narrow frame of time, and that way I don't affect the things happening before or after the mealtime. I don't dawdle. I'm not very good at casual suppers. I don't dawdle over my food. I don't wolf it down, but I sit down. I have time for conversation while I'm eating. I eat. When I'm done eating, I get up and I move on to the next thing. The same thing with sleep. I tend to get about 6 to 7 hours sleep a night. Sometimes less, but my average is 6 to 7 hours. I try to go to bed about the same time, around 11 o'clock at night. I get up about the same time, around 5:30 or 6 in the morning. And the time for shower, brushing the teeth, and other personal things. I will occasionally have a day where I don't do anything but, say, visit my grandchildren and play with them, or I'll take the wife shopping, or we'll get in the car and go for a drive. But my normal day, I get up, I do my breakfast. I now at 6:30 watch Maryland Public Television because they have this art show on at 6:30, and I like to watch it because I pick up some good techniques. But then from 7, when it goes off, I start writing, and I'll write for about an hour or 2 hours, and then I might read a book or review a book or go to my little studio I have in the garage and work on a painting. And I like to sort of not get so into one thing that it starts to get boring. I do things, and then when my interest starts to flag or I start to get tired, I move on to something else, and that way I never really lose interest in a project.
Again, it's amazing what you created for listeners. Certainly you can do a search for Ambassador Charles Ray on Amazon and find many of the books that he's published, but also the Foreign Service Journal and other magazines where you've written articles. So in terms of what you're producing with the written word over a period of time, it's really been quite extraordinary. So lots of books that are out there. One of the books that I have read and looked at and really enjoyed related to your grandmother. It was your first book.
Yes.
And that book was Things I Learned from My Grandmother About Leadership and Life. First, tell me about your grandmother, and then tell me about the central message of that book.
Well, my grandmother was born in the late 1800s, 1890 something. I have it written down. In fact, it's in the second edition of the book. I never remember. Never really had much of an opportunity for formal education. She did teach herself to read and do arithmetic, in her words, so that no one could cheat her, and she could read the almanac and her Sears and Roebuck catalog and her Bible. She was a tiny woman, probably about 5 feet tall, and I don't think she ever weighed over 100 pounds. But she was what I guess people back in her day would call a wildcat. I mean, she didn't take nonsense off anyone. She didn't have a lot of what she would call book learning, but she was one of the smartest people I know. I mean, she just she was just able to sort of figure things out and see connections where other people saw confusion. And I guess I probably get that from her. She had a way with words. I mean, she had a way of sort of throwing words together that was both humorous but educational at the same time. And, all those old folk things like, the sun don't shine on the same dog's back every day.
Yes.
Things I grew up listening to and thinking I had ignored because they were so corny, and only to realize when I was writing this book that I had internalized all of that. And in fact, it had the things that she would say, like, if you praise people when someone is listening, if you have to criticize them, you do it in private, or be careful what you do to people, because sometimes it hits them and bounces right back on, and I these things, I guess, like cockleburs, they stuck in my brain, and I realized when I was writing the book, which has an interesting genesis itself, that my way of managing and leading was actually based on a lot of this hokey old country folk wisdom she'd been pounding into my head all the years I lived with her, was thus the name of the book. And the book itself, by the way, grew out of when I was ambassador to Cambodia. I had a young guy, my economic officer at the embassy, who I had designated as my speechwriter because he was one of the better writers on the country team. And he used to follow me around, watching my speech patterns and my body language so he could, tailor remarks for me effectively. And he noticed, he would comment at times that I had a way, and he'd been in the Foreign Service himself, I guess, about 8 or 10 years, and he'd comment that my way of dealing with things was different than any other boss he'd had in the Foreign Service. So I sort of call it a lazy man's way of leadership. I don't believe in stressing people out if you don't have to. I mean, situations provide enough stress. When a boss comes into the situation and adds to the stress level, he's part of the problem, not the solution. And I don't do things that other people are being paid to do. If I have someone working for me whose job is to do X, while I am willing to do X and I will try to learn how X is done just so I can motivate him, I'm not going to do X. That's his job. I pay him to do it. And we would talk back and forth, and so one day he said, you really should write all that down, because a lot of people in the Foreign Service, which is definitely a group of type A pushy personalities when it comes to leadership and managing could benefit from it. I basically sort of nodded and said, yeah, at that point I was focusing on my next job. And so I really wasn't keen on the time it would take to actually sit down and do the research and write something like that. But anyway, that job ended. I came back to the U.S. and I ended up at the University of Houston as a diplomat in residence, which, while there was a lot of travel, because I had all of South Texas, which is bigger than most U.S. states, frankly, with 20 or 30 colleges and universities and hundreds of high schools and middle schools, and I had a pretty busy schedule in terms of travel, but it was never so much work that I didn't have time to just sort of sit and so I started thinking about his suggestion, and I started making notes. I did that for that year. Then I came back to Washington at the end of that year. This would have been 2006, and I was assigned to the Pentagon. And again, it was a job that I built more frequent flyer miles in that job at the Pentagon than I had ever had before. I was on a plane every 10 days, flying somewhere either within the U.S. or outside. And you spend hours on planes. You have time to think. So I really started seriously. But I was at a loss. How do I focus this book so one, people will pay attention to it, that it will teach them something. They'll get something out of it. What's the hook? How do I brand it? And it was driving me nuts. I mean, this went on for almost 2 years, from 2006, well, in the middle of 2005 actually, until almost the middle of spring of 2007. And one day I was on the metro. I'm going home from work, and somewhere between Bethesda and Grosvenor, these two schoolgirls got on. The Catholic schoolgirls from one of the upscale school for rich kids, and they start talking. And it's end of the day, commuters, they're tired, they really don't want to be hassled. And these girls were loud to the point where I really felt like going up and walking over and telling them to shut up, which would not have been a smart thing to do. I mean, it just, and I could tell, the other passengers are all sitting there looking uncomfortable and probably thinking and feeling the same as me. And this little old lady who was sitting on there got up, walked over, and she leaned over, and she wasn't frowning or snarling, and she didn't raise her voice, but I could see that finger moving, and it reminded me of my grandmother, and she was the same way. She could quietly scare the bejesus out of you. And these girls, their faces get like, their eyes go wide, and their cheeks get all red, and they're embarrassed. And their heads drop, and they get quiet. And this old lady smiles, and she goes back to her seat. And have you ever had one of those eureka moments? It's like serendipity.
Yes.
Wow, that's exactly what I've been looking for. That's where I learned my leadership, from my grandmother's guidance and instruction.
And that book is still out there, so if anyone wishes
Second edition is out as of last year, with some additional stuff that I put in post my grandmother, but related. And her pictures in the second edition. I have a cousin in Houston who's a historian who's been doing histories of our part of Texas, who had a picture of my grandmother, which had to have been taken sometime in the early 1900s, because she's young in the picture, with her first or second husband, I guess with my mother's father. And But yeah, it's still out there. It's more reasonably priced now. When it was first published, I went with this publisher who overpriced it, under-promoted it, and basically, I think, cheated me out of royalties, but that's neither here nor there.
Well, great resource for university students who are studying leadership, whether it's undergrad or graduate, MBAs or masters. It's based on a life of experiences, career, practical advice, and through the lens of a grandmother. I love that hook, and I'm glad you had that moment. And now, you being a grandfather, maybe your grandkids will be looking to you and writing.
Well, I hope it's interesting you mention that, because when I interact with my grandchildren, I channel my grandmother, but in a 21st century way. I remember her lack of formal education didn't keep her from encouraging me to be inquisitive and to learn and to read. And so I do the same with my grandchildren. I never, for instance, engaged in baby talk with them, not even when they were first learning to talk. I spoke to them in full sentences. The net result of that is my 7-year-old granddaughter scares the crap out of the teachers in Howard County, because when my daughter enrolled her in nursery school, she was already reading at a 2nd grade level. And the teachers they threw up their hands. I mean, she's now being homeschooled because the 1st grade teachers said there was absolutely nothing they could do for her.
Yeah.
So we're looking at not putting her in school, not putting her in formal schooling until she's probably 3rd or 4th grade, and then they'll have they have that, what do you call it, the separate tracks for the gifted children.
Maybe,
but 1st and 2nd grade would be an absolute boring experience.
Maybe in 30 years' time, when she's listening to this recording, she'll see how things turned out.
I have a feeling she'll do it long before 30 years. I mean, it's just the thing that I have learned over more than 50-year career, 56 now. I have to count the last 6 years of basically writing full-time as a career too. We tend to underestimate people, especially kids. We tend to think that kids don't get it, but the fact is that the human brain, absent some malfunction when you're born, is born capable. I mean, kids learn to talk, walk, feed themselves, potty train. Think about how incredible that is. Here's a brain that is absorbing things at a fantastic rate.
Yes, it's quite extraordinary.
And many times they do it despite the intervention of adults.
Yes.
But sometimes without the intervention of adults. And when you encourage it, it's amazing how, just to give you an example, my 2nd granddaughter, who is now 5, so they're 5, 7, and 4, she never crawled. Never once crawled. She would lie on the floor, sometimes push herself up into a sitting position, and she would watch her older sister, who's 2 years older, crawl around and walk around. She never crawled. One day, she pushed herself up and walked across the room. It's just it. And everyone's looking, and I'm thinking, but we lose sight of the fact that this is how we learn, by observing and practicing. And if you don't discourage it, if you literally let them be free-range children, it's amazing what they can learn to do. My 7-year-old figured out how elevators work from riding in one. She watched it go up and down, and in her mind she figured there had to be these pulleys, and she actually drew a picture of an elevator pulley system, having never seen one, just having figured it out from riding in an elevator. This is something, and I meander, but the fact is that as a leader, it's important that mental attitude. People are capable of a lot more sometimes than even they know. And if you want to be effective as a leader, what you have to do is figure ways to coax that out of them. You can't order it out, you can't coerce it out, but you can encourage them to ooze it out and encourage them to take risks. Encourage people to encourage them to fall down. Because my mantra is fall down, get up, keep going. Not how many times you fall down that matters, it's how many times you get back up. That's one from my grandmother too, by the way. This is,
She's almost here with us. Yes.
Yeah, she had that impact on people. Yeah.
So I really like that concept that you're talking about of having experiences in life where we fail and then we reflect back and we say, well, that was such a seminal moment in my life, in my career, or my personal life where I made a mistake and I learned from it. It humbled me, and through the humility I was able to improve and grow.
Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah, I mean, there's that. That's sort of the most profound end of it. But even in the mundane, I mean, if you put your hand. Oh no, let me think of a better one, because you shouldn't put your hand on a hot stove. I mean, that should go without saying. You can feel the heat. You lick a cold metal pole in the winter and your tongue sticks to it.
Yes.
When they pour the warm water over and your tongue comes free, unless your brain is completely dead, never to lick a cold pole again. And so even in the mundane things, you learn by experimentation. You try something, it doesn't work, you try it another way, and you keep trying until you find the way that gets it done.
What about this, if just using that analogy of the tongue on the pole, empathy as a leader, if you know that a negative thing is going to happen if a person goes down a certain path, and if you see a person putting their tongue on a cold pole, if it's going to result in the freezing, do you stop them? Do you allow them to experience it themselves? What do you do in that instance?
What I would do personally, rather than say don't do that because your tongue's going to stick to it, because I know my own personality, if you challenge me like that, I'm going to try and find out if you're telling me the truth or if you're joking. What I would probably do is say, consider what you're about to do. Here are some of the things that could happen, and then let them make the choice, having been told this could happen. And if they make the choice not to because they trust you, and if you've built trust, that can happen, that's fine. If, on the other hand, they listen to you and they go, oh, yeah, well, let me see if that happens to me, and they try it and it turns out it does, and they get their tongue off and they go, wow, you were right, you don't penalize them for doing it. In fact, see, most people, if they were to say you shouldn't do that because you might hurt yourself, and the person goes ahead and does it, and they hurt themselves, they realize they hurt themselves, and then you hurt them worse by criticizing them for not following that's the wrong way to go about it. You actually should recognize what happened there. They had enough of an independent mind and an independent streak to want to know for themselves. They tried it, they learned, and they acknowledged it. They accepted their responsibility for what happened. They should be applauded for that, because that's a learning moment. They have actually learned. It shouldn't become then about, well, you didn't follow my advice, so I'm upset with you. It should be, okay, so now you've learned. That's good. Now let's move on to the next thing. So that's
it's a
how
real positive view of leadership and managing people. That I like that idea of looking at not coming down hard on a person, certainly if they make the error, the mistake the first time, but encouraging them, saying you took a risk and
it messed up, and what are you going to do to fix it?
Yeah. And
Yeah,
Let's work together or something.
Yeah, well, I mean, yeah, well, we're all in this together. That's the other thing about leadership is that this we're all in it together should be sort of what you're about, is that you're in it with them. You're not above them, but I guess you could call it leading from the middle.
Mm-hmm.
You know, should you lead from the front or from the rear? Well, depending on the circumstances, there are times when you should be out front. There are other times when you should be in the back. But mentally, philosophically, you should be in the middle of the organization. You should be where your tentacles go out 360 degrees, and you sort of put your arms around the whole organization from the inside, if that makes sense, so that the people in that organization feel that you are one with them, not necessarily one of them. And this might sound conflicting. As a leader, you have to sort of pull yourself apart, what I call the view from the balcony, in order to be able to make objective decisions. At the same time, you have to be a part and you have to be a part.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Okay, you have to be a part, but you have to be a part at the same time, and it's a hard thing to do. It's a delicate balancing act. But what I'm trying to say is that you shouldn't have this. Okay, here's my leadership script, and everything that happens, I'm reading from the script. You have to be very flexible. You have to look at every situation and figure out in every unique situation, well, how do I handle this? And even in the same situation, how do I deal with this person in this situation, and how do I deal with that person in this situation?
Right.
And here's a good one. How do I deal with both of them in the same room at the same time in this situation?
Yes.
Which means you have to be pretty agile.
Yes.
You can't have this, I'm a type A manager, so here's, or I'm a type Z manager, and I'm totally laissez-faire. Yes. There are times, for instance, it's an unpleasant thing to do, but there are times in an organization when you have to get rid of people because of misbehavior or performance or whatever. Mm-hmm. You have to do what you have to do.
Yes.
But you don't have to rob them of even the person you're firing for misbehavior, you don't have to rob them of their dignity.
Yes.
I was recently watching all of the retrospectives on George H.W. Bush, and his reaction to the fall of the Soviet Union and the fact that he refused to gloat about it. He basically left the former Soviets with their dignity. They knew they failed. They didn't need him to trumpet their failure. That's what a good leader does. You never rob a person of their dignity. Again, going back to the old country wisdom, you corner a rabbit and it'll fight. Jimmy Carter found that out on a fishing trip once. So the thing is that the person you are having to fire today, for instance, might turn their lives around and get lucky, and one day they're head of the organization that you are beholden to. I just use that as an example. Yes. A war story. I once worked with a gentleman when I was a young captain, and he was I think he was a junior lieutenant colonel, and he was absolutely gracious. I mean, despite our rank difference, he always treated me with respect. He always treated me with dignity. I mean, he was demanding, but he wasn't nasty in his demands. He insisted on a good job being done, but he also gave credit where that job was when you did a good job. So and we worked together for 6 or 8 months, I suppose, about that. But I was stuck in my mind is this lieutenant colonel he was just a nice guy. Well, fast forward many years later, I retired from the Army, joined the Foreign Service. I make my way up through the ranks, and I was Consul General in Ho Chi Minh City. I had just been promoted into the Senior Foreign Service, roughly the equivalent of a 1-star general. And who gets sent to Vietnam to work on a project under my direction? Now a bird colonel, but he's subordinate to me. Mm-hmm. And first of all, I had no. I always try to treat people right, but it sort of dawned on me. Here's a guy who once was my boss, and now I'm his boss. Now, suppose he'd been. I can think of a colonel I worked for years ago. If he ever worked for me, I would treat him with respect, but it would be grudging. Mm-hmm. So this is. This is sort of a selfish way of looking at it, but you always, it's the old saying, be careful who you step on your way up because you'll meet them on your way back down. You should treat people the way you want to be treated, because if you treat them badly and someday the shoe is on the other foot, you can't complain if karma comes back and bites you.
Mm-hmm. You've talked a lot about your experience, your military service, which you started at a very young age. You were about 17, 18 years old when you entered
Actually,
the Army.
I started a week before my 17th birthday.
Okay.
I didn't officially join the Army until the 9th of July, which was 4 days after my birthday, but I was already at basic training at the time.
That's amazing.
And yeah, I was in the Army from the 9th of July, 1962, when I was just turned 17, to the 1st of September, 1982, right after I'd turned 37.
So you were young. You had put in 20 years, and
yeah.
So you were coming out young, and then you had this, in a way, this second career in the Foreign Service. You were
Yep.
And by the way, in your Army career, you had served in Vietnam.
Two tours.
Yeah, and then you had this new chapter coming into the Foreign Service. You were a 2-time ambassador to Zimbabwe and Cambodia.
Yeah.
And so you had a lot of unique experiences, both in the Foreign Service and in the U.S. Army. You wrote a book about effective leadership for the 21st century.
Yes.
And as you think about that arc of American history of the 60s, you just a kid growing up in Texas going into the Army. We'll give you 17 years old when you went in.
Yeah.
And then the Vietnam.
Legally you have to.
And then the Vietnam experience and 2 tours, and then the tours in the Foreign Service, being separated from the family, and those challenges of being in the Foreign Service, 2-time ambassador, and now you write this book about taking charge and effective leadership in the 21st century. That arc, how do you see right now leadership, not only the role of the United States in the world, but just overall leadership? How has it changed? Where are the stresses for leadership, and then again, the role of the United States in the world? So perhaps 2 questions.
Well, on the stresses on leadership in government and probably across the board are pretty significant right now. I'm actually writing a lecture that I will be giving at American University in March on what I call ethical leadership mm-hmm. in ethical diplomacy, addressing how leadership in foreign affairs and diplomacy is stressed by the current political power structure that has a rather loose relationship with facts and truth, and focuses on winning at all costs and the sort of exclusion instead of inclusion. We're in a situation right now where the people at the top on the political side are so inwardly focused, so focused on personal gain rather than the nation writ large, and who have forgotten what politics is supposed to be about, which really sort of puts a heavy burden on the bureaucracy, if you will, on the sort of, I guess what they would call in Britain the permanent secretaries, the people who hold their jobs down from administration to administration. And I'm really looking at that now as how do you train people to deal with this degree of disruption in a way so that they have a choice other than total surrender of their integrity or quit. I mean, there has to be a middle ground, because if everyone with integrity quits, then you have a government without integrity, and that's not good for the country or the world. But if the people surrender all their integrity and just follow their orders, you have the same situation. You know, there has to be some integrity left in the governing processes. It has to reside somewhere, and it's not impossible. Difficult. It is difficult, but not impossible. I mean, it reminds me of, I was at a meeting this morning with Tom Pickering, who jokingly said, you get your talking points, but you don't have to follow them exactly. And his point there is, when you are in a situation, you're in the field, you need to know how to get done what's required to be done by law, without creating unnecessary disruption, and looking at what is in the best interest of the country, because you have to remember that especially in the Foreign Service and military officers similarly, we take an oath to the Constitution. We don't take an oath of allegiance to a particular elected leader. Yes, our oath says we will follow the orders of those people above us, and that includes the elected leadership, but that does not mean you have to, here, my view on that is the political leader tells me what he wants me to achieve. I'm fine with that. I will figure a way to achieve it. When he tells me how he wants me to do it, then we're going to have some discussions, because he might want to have something done a certain way for political impact, when in fact it could have even more severe negative consequences down the road. He should be focusing on, he wants a certain thing done, not a certain thing done in a certain way. That's the permanent staff, the permanent employees should not be used politically. And they need to be taught how not to allow themselves to be used politically. It takes effort. The military does it. I mean, in the military, for example, it's very clear in the Uniform Code of Military Justice, while it's a hierarchical system and you are bound to follow the orders of those above you in the chain of command, you are responsible for obeying an illegal order. And when you are, particularly as an officer, you are told you have a responsibility to your commander when he tells you to do something. If you see something amiss with what he's telling you, you have a responsibility to tell, and an obligation to tell him. And if he's a good leader, he will listen. And he might not agree with you, but he will listen, and he will take it on board. And then if he still decides he wants it done, you do it or you quit. I mean, if it's a red line, if it's a red line on your integrity, you quit. If it's But there are always ways to do your talking points without following them verbatim.
Yes, there's a lot of wisdom in that, and
Yeah.
I like what you're saying about ethical leadership, and you've written a lot on this subject as well, and even chaired committees that have focused on ethical leadership within the Foreign Service, but also beyond the Foreign
Yeah.
Service. And that's great to hear that you're going to be speaking to students. I love that idea, the talking points. Thank you very much. You may not necessarily follow them right down to.
Yeah. I will get done what you want done,
Yes.
but I will get it done in the way that I think is most effective.
Is there a metaphor for that, for life, for younger listeners that may be in university, where university can be very regimented and structured, like you take this class, you take this many credits, you come away with this degree, and it's a very regimented process where in a way it's like talking points. This is what you need to do to get here. What would your advice be to college
Well,
students?
I mean, yeah, I spent 20 years in the military, and that's pretty regimented too. But just because you're in a regimented situation, it doesn't mean you have to become a mindless drone. You know, well, I'll use my own educational experience as an example. I left high school and I joined the Army, and then as soon as I got settled in the Army after I finished the initial training and was assigned to my first unit, I started taking night courses. And I had no particular degree in mind. I had no particular goal in mind. I actually found that I enjoyed reading, and I enjoyed the classes and the discussions. And so I took courses in everything. I mean,
Doesn't surprise me.
It just, I mean, I
Yes.
took
Yes.
Russian, I took
Yes.
mechanical drafting, I took abnormal psychology, I mean, you know, history. After about 10 years of this, it suddenly dawned on me I really should get a degree. I mean, it just, and at that time I had enough credits for 2 degrees in 4 different disciplines because I had just bounced all over. I mean, I'd taken geography, I mean, you know, you name it. So I enrolled in a school. They had what they call back in those days the bootstrap program, where if you had enough credits to graduate and you had to do your mandatory, I think you had to have 25 on-campus resident credits in order to get a degree from a school, the Army would actually give you the time off with pay to go to school full-time. So I did. I enrolled in a college in Atchison, Kansas, which had been a boys' Catholic school, St. Benedict's, and it had merged with the girls' school, Mount St. Scholastica, to become Benedictine College. I went, the year I enrolled, the summer I enrolled, was the first session of the co-ed institution. And I signed up for my 25 hours, which went from summer session and first semester, which ended in December. I only needed 3 courses, and I decided I would do business administration. I only needed 3 courses, so I took 3 challenging courses. One was economics, which was almost my undoing because I had never taken calculus, and I had a professor who insisted that you had to explain the derivation of demand curves with calculus. So I had to take a night course in calculus in order to pass economics. But then I took abnormal psychology, I took theater arts, I took all kinds of other...
And that continues to this day, your curiosity of just life and learning.
Yeah,
and,
but I mean, the point I'm making is you do the requirements, you do what is necessary to achieve what you're trying to achieve. But if your mind is open, you find that you have other things that you also can do. I mean, in the military, I started out, I was commissioned initially as a field artillery officer. You know, that's the guys with the, you know, they pull the lanyards and the big guns go boom. Except that after training and commissioning, I never got to do that. I was stuck in odd assignments here and there. I ended up in Special Forces training, and the next thing I knew, I was involved in strategic reconnaissance, and I realized that I hadn't checked the proper blocks as an artillery officer. So I petitioned for a change, and I was switched from field artillery to military intelligence. And so I mean, it's and even then I didn't check all the blocks. I managed to go through from 1969, when I switched to intelligence, until I retired in 1982. I went through, I did a counterintelligence tour. I did a sort of straight up handling foreign agents intelligence tour, and then I did a whole bunch of other things had nothing to do with intelligence until I retired.
Yes. So we've talked about the Army experience, the Foreign Service experience, writing, ethical leadership. I don't want you to get away until we talk about what you've produced in the genre of Western literature. I think it's amazing. You've written about this Bass Reeves,
yes,
a character,
my favorite character,
and you created lots of fiction around Western characters, in addition to all that you've been talking about with your more formal career. And again, books are out there for people. In fact, a book just came out, about
I did one,
Christmas Carol,
the Cowboys Christmas Carol, which is an adaptation of Dickens' Christmas Carol.
That's awesome.
Which is starting to pick up. Sales are starting to pick up.
Awesome.
I wouldn't call it Western literature, because I say Western stories. I mean, because what I write is not literature in the high-brow sense of literature. I'm more like the pulp fiction writers of the 40s and 50s who used to crank out a book a week. They were storytellers. They put a plot together with some interesting characters and interesting dialogue to entertain people. And that's my first objective with what I write, the fiction, is to entertain. And if I can, you actually can teach people better when you're entertaining them than when you're lecturing to them. I started writing the Westerns by accident. My young staff, when I was ambassador to Zimbabwe, we would sit around sometimes chatting, and I realized that they didn't. I grew up watching the Westerns of the 50s, which were historically inaccurate, but at least gave you an idea. Well, I mean, those are all gone, and these kids grew up not even seeing that, and so they were clueless about the real history of the American West. And I thought, well, I could sit here and lecture them, or I could entertain them. So I did some research. My first overseas assignment was in the 24th Infantry Division, Army, which is a successor to the 24th Infantry Regiment, which was formed in 1875 as part of the U.S. Colored Troops. 24th Regiment of Infantry was an all-black unit, black soldiers with white officers. There were also two cavalry units, the 9th and 10th. You had the 9th and 10th Cavalry and the 24th and 25th Infantry. So I had an interest in this, having served in that unit. But infantry, it's not interesting. So I like the cavalry, it's just so dashing. So I started doing research, and I started writing this series of short novels about the 9th Cavalry, especially their time in Texas and New Mexico from about 1875 through about 1890. And those actually started selling pretty well, which I thought, wow, And I was billing them as historical fiction, but after a point I noticed that people, when they were reviewing them on Amazon, were referring to them as Westerns. But Westerns that look at the history of the American West as it actually was, rather than the popular media's depiction. And during the research for one of the Buffalo Soldier books, which was the nickname that the Apache gave to the to the black cavalrymen, I ran across reference to Bass Reeves, and and it was fascinating. So I started doing research on him. He was a former slave. He'd never been allowed to go to school, so he couldn't read or write English. During the Civil War, he ran away to Indian Territory in what's now Oklahoma, and he stayed there until Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation. In the meantime, he learned 6 Indian languages. He was an expert tracker, an expert marksman. He was 6'2" and weighed 200 pounds and had fists as big as small hams. So he was a pretty formidable person for that age when people were relatively small, who in 1875 was hired as a deputy U.S. Marshal out in Fort Smith, Arkansas, one of a group of African Americans who were hired, and their primary job, although they were full-fledged deputy marshals authorized to enforce the law anywhere in Arkansas, Texas, Louisiana, Indian Territory, they were basically hired because it was believed that as African Americans they would find more cooperation from the Indians in Indian Territory than a white deputy would, for obvious reasons. I mean, Indian Territory, that's where a lot of the eastern tribes were moved to after they were kicked off their lands, and so they weren't exactly very pro-government.
Yeah.
He still couldn't read or write English, but he had a phenomenal memory, so he would have someone read warrants and wanted posters for him, and he would memorize them. And then he would go into the territory, and he always got his man or woman. I mean, he in his 30-year career, he brought in like 3,000 fugitives. He wasn't gun happy like a lot of deputy marshals who basically they went after a bad guy and they would bring a body back, and you wanted dead or alive was actually a real thing. His thing was let the judge decide whether they die or not. He, in his 30-year career, he only had to kill 14 men, and he only did that when they fired first or tried to fire.
Yeah, just an amazing story.
And anyway,
you've the Army career, Foreign Service, writing. Maybe a new career could be writing musicals or something. I'm not sure. Or plays.
Yeah, I'm tone deaf when I have to drink too much to be able to carry a tune.
Yes.
But no, my new career, I'm playing with the idea of, because I've been drawing and painting since I was a kid too. Mm-hmm. Started with copying cartoons in the newspaper when I was little. Of doing book covers. I do a lot of my own covers when I do paperbacks. Mm-hmm. And after I did the first Bass Reeves book, a Western publisher in Texas contacted me, and we went back and forth, and so now I'm doing a series of short novels about Bass Reeves for him. Mm-hmm. That drew the attention of a publisher in England, and under a pen name I do westerns, and under my own name I do short stories for anthologies for him. Mm-hmm. And we were going back and forth on something. I commented on a book cover that I thought was a little boring, and I sent him a watercolor I did. He said, it should be something like this, and now he wants to know if I do two or three a month.
That's it. That's
so I'm looking at possibly doing watercolors to my.
Yeah.
Doing book covers to my repertoire for other people. Again, like I said, I do my own. But if other people want them, okay, that's fine. I'm happy with that.
It's such a pleasure speaking with you. Again, you're such I think the variety of things that you do relates a lot to your first references to your grandmother, a person maybe who didn't have the opportunities that you've had in life, and yet was a person, as you describe her, who was very wise and alert to the world, and yet she hadn't had the opportunities you've had to travel. And so it's almost like you've, through your efforts in your life and your career, you've given her such a tribute And I do hope your grandkids follow that example. And is there anything, just sort of last points on leadership, just core leadership values and principles that you would like to add here at the close?
Well, leadership, leadership to me is the art of getting people to achieve more than they feel or think they're capable of achieving. Pure and simple. Mm-hmm. I mean, leadership is all about building the capacity of people to get things done and to be a part of something bigger than themselves. And that sounds sort of high-flown, but I mean, even if you're a little league baseball coach, getting a bunch of kids to do things that they or their parents think they're, doesn't matter whether they win games. The fact is, if they come out, as I was once worked for Rich Armitage when he was Deputy Secretary of State, and his injunction to all ambassadors going out at the time was, don't care what you do and get treaties signed and the local government thinks you're great, if the people working for you can't say at the end of your tenure that they're better off for your having been there, you're a failure. To me, that's the essence of leadership. As a leader, you strive to leave an organization in better shape than you found it.
Ambassador Charles Ray, thank you so much for your time.
My pleasure.
Thank you for listening to Clydebuilt Conversations from Clydebuilt International. Please visit us at clydebuiltnow.org. Thank you.